you can choose. We will start talking about totally new different stuff, which is Python. Okay, let's get started. So we will first wrap up the graphic modeling in terms of sensitivity analysis. And then we will start talking about totally new different stuff, which is Python. But first, let's get the workflows for sensitivity analysis and we'll finish it. If you have not done so, please get it from the lecture statement. So generally for the course, I think we may release the assignment 2, maybe on Friday. When you release it, you will have maybe 2 weeks to complete it. So you have plenty of time to work on it. And it will be a similar but much simpler exercise on graphic modeling and also one exercise on power query editing. So that will be the second one. So for the sensitivity analysis, let's first recall what we did in the basic case. Right? If you remember, throughout the last lecture, we were talking about a multi-regional production planning model, which is quite complicated, much more complicated than the original exam session in the previous year. Then we set up the base case, and this is also the reason why in the first step of the sensitivity analysis, we have nothing else to do but to finish the base. For the base case, for the decision variables, which is the production quantity in the 3 regions, in the 3 markets, NAU and Asia, we are assuming that they're being constant, 20,000. In the what-if analysis, potentially we are going to change. We're going to talk about several what-if analysis, including the simplest case, which is to change a single input, which we already talked about. We will talk about briefly. We will talk about it briefly already. The data tables will vary simply 1 or 2 parameter inputs and see how the outcome and the whole calculation will behave in a different way. And in the end, we will do the ultimate what-if analysis, which is to optimize the decision given on any kind of result. So as we already did, partially, at the end of the previous lecture, we will do the most general two-way data table. By a two-way data table, we really mean that we want to vary the value of input parameters of 2 at the same time. Specifically, the question we were asking is, so we are changing 2 parameters at the same time, both the selling price as well as the unit production cost. For the selling price, we're changing from 25 to 35, which is $1 increase, 25 times 6 and so on. For the production cost, we're changing from $5 to 15 all the way to $50, and each time we increment $1. So the data table will be the tool that we use for this, and in the workflow of sensitivity analysis, we break down by step how do we construct the data table. So we will start with the most general case, which is the two-way data table, and later, once you know how to build a two-way data table, a one-way is simple. So for this two-way data table, we first will list out, because we are changing 2 variables at the same time, one will be changing across the columns, the other will be changing across the rest. So we will list them out. For example, when you construct these varying values, you can put the first and the second, 5, 6. Then you do not need to manually put in all the values, and because Excel will know that by dragging them down. Not making myself. Nevertheless, let's assume that the values are all pre input into the rows and the columns. So we're changing production cost in this column, and we're changing the selling price in the first row. Then after specifying the potential values that we are going to take, a very critical step is to, at the top left corner of the data table, which is supposed to be empty, we make a direct reference to the original objective. The objective, if you recall, was the total profit across the whole year, across all the markets. So we are going to make a direct reference. In this case, it's in 19. The purpose of doing this, again, let me repeat the mechanism of how the data table works. For each potential combination, for example, we are going to fill in all the tables. For example, what will be the value for this specific step? Excel will compute it for us. So instead, it will change the input value of production cost to $8, and it will change the selling price to $26. And then Excel will automatically, we cannot see it, it will do it in the back page, do all the calculations again, and output in the cell the final objective value here in the cell. And in other cells, of course, there are other combinations of things. So as the last step, we complete the data table by finding the output. So the way to construct the final step, the way to complete the data table is first by selecting the whole table, including the rows, the columns, as well as the cell that we refer to the objective value. Then we go to data. We go to data, and then what if analysis, there's a data table. You can see there are many different other tools that we can use for the what if analysis. So for this example, we are going to cover both data table and both. Scenario manager is that's personally used to use for. So after click on data table, there will be a very small window, and there are only two things that we need to do. So because we have already selected table area, table range, we need to specify what is the row input cell and what is the column input. In other words, when Excel is re-evaluating or recomputing those values, we know it's taking different values for this column and it's taking different values for this row. But what's in the original input table are the corresponding values that it was changing. So we know what they represent, right? So the row input cells that represents this row across this row. We are changing the cell. So the setting price of NA. So we know which cell to make the reference. It will be the setting price of the original 30 value. What Excel will do is by changing this 30 to other potential differences. And for the column input cell, it's the same logic. So across this column, for this column, what value is changed in the original input? We know it's the production cost in A. So it's the original system. So if you think about it, everything kind of makes sense because by referring to the original cell, Excel will replace the default values, 30, 12, by the new value, by the new combination of values, like 25 and 5. Then it will make the computation and fill in all the potential objective values. So if you compare after you compute the data table, you can compare with the final output of that. And since the output should be consistent with our intuition, when the production cost is higher, of course, our objective, the profit will be lower. And if the selling price is higher, in general, we will have a higher cost. So towards the end, we will have lots of cost. So this is the way that we construct a two-way data. Unfortunately, in Excel, the worksheet is only two-dimensional. So if you want to change, for example, more than 3 potential inputs at the same time, well, a data table may not support that. But if you want to reduce dimensions by changing, here we are changing 2 input parameters at the same time. If you want to only change one parameter, this is called a one-way data table. The things will be even easier because you can either put it in a row or in columns. Usually we can put all these potential values in columns. So the next spreadsheet will show us how to do the one-way data, which is we no longer need to change 2 parameters at the same time. We change one parameter. So here we are only changing the okay, again, for unit production cost. So here, we assume in a one-way data table, we take the simple version. We assume the selling price, the unit, will be fixed as the original input of $30, and we are going to change production cost. The range is usually I will give it to you the ranges, or you will determine based on your own expertise. But the procedures will be exactly the same. So first, you construct the table, and on the top, before referring to the objectives, you will create a new column consist of all the potential values you want to vary for you. In this case, it will be all the potential unit production costs. And then on the top, you leave one row empty, and in the empty cell, which is this cell, similarly to refer to the original objective. This step is critical because without this step, Excel will not understand what is the output value that you are trying to. And then the remaining all the things, we will select the whole range, including all the potential varying values, that column, as well as the cell that we are referring to as the final objective. So once we make the selection, we will again go to data, what is analysis to the table. So here it's even simpler. In the previous example, or two-way data table, we need to specify both the row and the column. But here, for a row, we don't have a row of changing values, but only a column. So we can leave the row input cell empty. And the row and the column input cell, same as before, we will refer to the original input. The cell of original $12, so we can get the So once we click OK, we will again have the same output, but only by changing one line. A one-way. Two things quite true. As long as you do not fill in row into the cell, you can random other. Really do not. We are not really seeing any rows. So this is the first type of the what-if analysis. This will be extremely useful when you want to change your certain parameters, one parameter or 2 parameters simultaneously in multiple values. Because if it's only a single value, for example, if you want to explore, we talk about this in the previous lecture. If you want to explore a simple case where you directly change the input service production cost of $12 to $10, we can directly manually change. So if you change it to 10, you should have the same output here. But the data table, the reason that it's convenient is that it will automatically give a list or a sequence of what you can have. If you have a very long potential and number list that we enumerate all the what if scenarios of changing the unit production cost from $10 to $17, we can even include more features. We do not need to manually and test the objectives over and over. Data table will generate automatically. This is especially useful in the two-way data table because we enumerate all the possibilities, all the combinations. Here we have more than 100. It's impossible to do it manually. So this is data table. And then in the previous, this was the question C on the previous year's exam. So question C will be using GoSec, which is, I would argue, is even simpler than data table. GoSec on the very high level will help us deal with the question that if we want a certain value or a certain output to take a fixed value, in this case, let's see what the question part C will ask. So it asks what value of production quantity in NA will lead to a break-even. What do we mean by a break-even case? Actually, means the total cost of exactly. Break-even means that we're not making money, we're not losing money. So in this case, GoSec will be helpful because I didn't prepare an exact spreadsheet. We will use that one basically. Let's suppose that, of course, we care the most about the final cost. And in order to reach a certain profit growth, let's see the profit growth is like the profit exact value of the profit, for example, 0. Then we have to carefully adjust certain inputs for the profit to become 0. We cannot directly change the profit because it's coming from the very complicated computation. So we cannot just replace it by this. So instead, we are going to use GoSec, and there are certain limitations of GoSec. It will change one of the specified inputs. And by changing the input, you can imagine the output into the profit will also be changing the sum. So Excel will automatically change the input so that your output will hit the exact value. So let's try to use it. So again, it's under what if analysis and the GoSec. So there are three things to specify on the GoSec. The first option is the target cell, which usually is the cell that you are interested in. In most cases, we are the objective. So whether you select the objective. And then we want to explore, or we want to find a case where it's taking an exact value. The question asks us for break-even case. So break-even case means that we have a total cost of exactly. So what this GoSec tool will do for us is we will specify an input cell that Excel will try changing the value of each cell so that as long as the objective, the output, becomes 0, it will solve it. As you can imagine, here we are changing the production quantity of NA, right? By default, we are producing, this is our division level. So by default, we are producing 20,000. If we produce less, or if we produce more, I mean, of course, we are going to see. If we produce less, we may not be able to satisfy the demand, which will potentially lead to a lower profit. But if we produce more, then of course there's no point because the demand always is negative. And if we produce more, then we would end up with a lot more inventory. So you can compare this with the basic case. Because we have more inventory, we will have a higher inventory holding cost. And therefore, all our previously earned profit will be gone. So here, GoSec is not only useful when we're talking about the break-even. You talk about, instead of caring about the case, the other case where we are directly making 0 profit to either earning money or losing money, we can also do some other, like we set objectives to a very large value, 30, 300 profit by changing the cell single currency. I mean, I don't even know whether this is viable because it is possible that it's never reached. Excel will try to find. But of course, only by changing a single production quantity, leaving the other two as a constant, well, it turns out that our target goal of profit is so high that we cannot even reach. So in optimization, this is because we do not have a feasible solution. So our goal is too high too. But if we don't, maybe we can try something different. Slightly lower, maybe this one. Then smaller. So here, the question asks for a 0, which is break-even, not necessarily. Well, So as you can see, if we produce slightly below our original quantity, and because we incur a less inventory holding cost while satisfy all the demands, we can keep track of the units here. So we will be reaching that goal of 190,000. So goal 6 is, I would personally argue, even simpler in operation compared to data safety, because every time we are thinking that we're only changing a single unit. And also we are fixing the output, which is the objective, at a fixed value, which we do not know whether it is optimal. So this is the second phase of what we do. And now here comes the final and ultimate step. As someone who works in the field and who research in the field of operations management and optimization, well, this is the most important step. Because after the data table and after the goal set, we may naturally have this step. So if we are allowed to change all the three production quantity values, what is the best scenario that we can do in terms of the function? In other words, we want to optimize our decision as using the production. Well, in this course, we're not going into very detailed about this because I know many of you, especially if you are maybe able to other courses in LB and the. So we're going to just briefly introduce how to use solver. The solver is by definition not strictly a kind of what-if analysis, something more complex. So the button is on the panel. There's a button called solver. If you do not have, you still have the solver button on your university account, but if it's on your, for example, on your personal PC, if you do not have, you can quickly follow this object. And the add-in really is installed, but not like, or you can install it if it's not there. So by using solver, we are offering a more flexible platform to optimize. Optimize is a very tricky concept in that we are going to consider all the possible scenarios and only take the extreme output. In that case, we are trying to maximize the total profit. We have tried with different inputs, and the profit can be break even, which is 0. In the base case, the profit is slightly above 100,000. But then we must exclude what is the highest possible value. Right? So to do that, for a typical optimization problem like this, there are 3 to 4 different factors of things which we can use most of them. Right? So first is the objective, which is total profit for already happening. Then it was the decision variable. Decision variables are 3 individual production quantities in the market. And then we also need to think about something called constraints. Means that we have certain limitations on the expressions of the model. Because if we go back to the original question we say, we have a constraint that the total production quantity means that the 3 values sum up together does not exceed 30,000. So this is a new constraint which was not satisfied in the base case, because in the base case we have 20,000 multiplied by 3. It's far beyond the system. So we will say that constraint is inviolate. So that is not a feasible solution. So let's suppose for a moment we do not have it and try to find an optimal solution. So let's take a look at it. We already have certain things, but I think all the references are wrong. So this is quite a large window. And here we need to specify the several elements for the vectors that I was talking about. First one is the objective. So the objective here is specified. So the objective will be total profit. So we manually select. And then we need to decide whether we want to maximize or minimize the effect. Maximize means the larger the better. Minimize means the lower the better. Here, profit, of course, the more the scenario, like we are maximizing the profit. And then by changing the variable sales, these are the decision variables. These are the 3 production sources. We can change the length of the weight. And for the current constraint, it's not correct. That's easy. So let's see first. Let's suppose for a moment we do not have any constraint. So if we can decide freely on the production quantity, what value of production quantity will give us the largest possible profit? And here are some other options I will not go into very detail. This one is in case you are requiring your decision variable to be non-negative. So here, of course, if you take it of our production quantity, you cannot ever produce negative amount of value. And also, this is very interesting case because in the drop-down list, it will select a solving algorithm, depending on your problem type. Again, many of you may be learning from another course, learning so-called LP, which is a linear system. But what we are doing here is much more complicated. Why? If you try to use LP, right, it will give you error. Because our problem is not linear. By linear, we mean everything is deployed. The reason that our problem is not linear is we have the field equal to the minimum between demand and agreement. That minimum function is not linear. But thanks to the other solvers, we can use the nonlinear solvers. solver has converged to a current solution, and you will need to manually check whether the current solution is the solution. So let's see. Remember, this is not the answer to the question because we have not considered the constraints yet. This is just quickly showing you, without any constraints, what will be the optimal solution. We actually know a lot of things that our original production was because we think the original 20,000 we end up with a lot of unfinished cells, unfinished units, and therefore sometimes, well, sometimes it's now to understand. Now you already not quite on time. But again, we're not going to practical solve a knowledge problem. Sometimes we solve some of the so here the message for the reason have that like said there's five because any level on any other. So the first solution is very simple. But the solution it is beyond our limits. The exam question is that okay, the production quantity, the summation, the total production quantity of three ingredients brought together does not exceed 30,000. So how can we import this? Well, the current one might give us a very, very large profit, but it will not satisfy our constraint. So this is simple. We will go back to solver and manually add in the constraint. Potentially, you can have a long, long list of them. But in this example, we will only have one. Let's add a new constraint. Scale reference is the summation of the total production quantity. Will be less or equal to, you can manually put in 30,000. Or you can refer to another cell and put in that requirement outside. We will okay with that. So if you try to use the nonlinear solver to solve this problem, again, it will find a solution that will try to maximize the total profit while keeping the summation below or equal to our limit, which is 30. So you can see here with the actual constraints, our objectives will be lower. Because with more constraints, the number of possible options will be the set of possible options or the physical area, the physical range will be smaller. So we are forced to choose some original suboptimal inferior variables to satisfy our condition. Again, or like kind of that. Final statement. That's it. This is what any other. So this is about the next lecture. I will first try to not remind you, but still it's a different way of the house. I may have something for the next lecture. Eric will have questions. And it's something. Yes. Start with several facts. Relative to so the way that you're looking at it, upstairs, and so there are two different ways. One is offline. other is online. Online. Further processing. Let me first offline. So you need to get that desktop. By the way, one thing I just remind you that whatever operations, whatever file, update, once you step down, it will not fix. So, for example, that will write about the cell exercise, will probably have data of file and also there are two types of one is like itself, it's automatically solved. So without doing anything, that's good. But there are certain other software that are not solved. You will have to manually install every time of whether that's also every like, every time you want online. Let's double click on that. Any of the software here. But it's very special. And because they're finding and it's alphabetically sorted, there's also one of the way to deploy it is when it is deployed. About deploying actually also I just think of Python as or the program Python as range and so people go to like global and of course that's like other stuff. By the way, so it's also also the there's dialogue. So up to there's and then after everything is done, there's a click. You'll do a directory of current and somewhere find the directory and create that's for example that's option. That's also create the work of direct I know that's fine. So this is like a whole new software that files. Note that you're not creating by the file that we are free. And then we need to ask you to back the kernel. Kernel is again the programming language of the and this is here that's how I also other ways like other languages are and so those ranges of time and we are ready to run. So this is the offline version of deploying and we will if you find okay I have not every time. So alternatively, online version because it's when every time you connect, like you simply think by the way What does it mean? Actually, will give us an online environment of Google Notebooks where we can upload and work on existing workflows in the online environment without the need of installing anything object. So we will click on the Google Lab, first option, and it will give us a similar user interface. And sometimes it's even better because you are using your personal PC in the Mac. It has certain apps that is just better than what it has. Basic. So, the big thing. Interactive playground. Interactive online version of the user. You already have some 625. That's work on your input. Same thing. Any our local or offline. This was the same also. Have downloaded all the security by authentic. I upload whatever and so I pass visit online. That is upload out. 99% of the case, they are both types, the different versions of types. But if you want to switch other alternatives, you can use. Because this is the online version, we have some other new options. If you are more comfortable working in another language instead of Python, like C++, or feel free to use, although it's not quite relevant. It will take some time to reload, and we are ready. So far, I'm not using any Python lyrics. It's all about user notebooks, user interface. How do we get used to the new? Any questions? We're not there yet. We haven't started writing any code and run any of them. But first, I want you to get familiar. Pick the option you like, whether it's offline or online. Let me open the slide and quickly talk about some background information about the new programming. So today's lecture is supposed to be very introductory, but for those of you who have zero background, it may be a lot of. You can see for the slide we have more than 140. Many of them are repeated information, so don't worry. So this is what we're going to cover. We may only have the time to finish the first three: objects, variables, data types, strings, including some methods. And for the composable statements, we will probably only have the time to solve. And we'll finish next week. So let's start briefly talking about Python before we write our code in Python. So what is Python? Please bear with me with this a little bit terrifying image, because Python originally in the English word is used to kind of, and I'm not exactly sure why. It is a general purpose programming language. Last time I checked, we developed it was the third of the programming. Well, last year, this year I tried again, but still, let's see. So this Stack Overflow developer survey happens every year. So it's a platform that surveys professional coders and professional AI users of their most favorite programming languages. And let's see, if Python is not on top, what's top? Instead of in 2023, let's directly take a look at this is the survey from 2025. So the most up-to-date ranking. So the several tops are relatively stable across in recent years. The tops are JavaScript, HTML, CSS, SQL, and Python. Previously, Python was number third, but it's very close to third. Then, if you ask me, my personal favorite, or the way is the most common programming language I personally use in my own research, is of course Python and R, quite slow, and really cannot even be found. So you naturally will have one question. If Python is not the number one popular, although it's very close, why do not we directly learn JavaScript? Right? So the quick answer to that question will be the learning curve is so good. Recall that this survey is the technology survey is for the professional developers. In other words, they're professional coders. So some of them may already quite familiar with multiple languages. So to show you exactly why we're learning Python, this is across all the respondents, and we have other aspects, other perspectives. For example, for professional developers, Python is still the source, but for beginners like us, we are trying to learn how to code. Python is definitely the number one. In other words, if you have zero background in programming, if you never write a single line of code, the most recommended programming language would be Python. To share a bit of my personal history or personal experience, when I was in my undergrad, my first programming course was using C++, which was a nightmare. I was totally lost halfway through it. But well, Python and R, they are relatively beginner friendly. You can also check with others. Learners who use AI also very good. Aside from it, many of you may have tried it before. If you ask certain programming or coding related questions, without explicitly asking the large models like GPT or Gemini or Pilot to generate the code, if by default it's generating some code, most likely this will be. So just to make sure, to ensure you that Python is widely used and maybe people of the perspective. Yes. So most commonly used Python data everything. Also, so here, not an exhaustive list of strengths. It has a relatively simple syntax. Of course, not as simple as what we learn in Excel, because Excel is barely language. It is beginner friendly. It is versatile. It is open source. This is very important because in the future you may work in a large company that uses its own language, which may not be open. One of the most powerful merits of Python is that it has it's not the largest, it's probably the largest and active community. Because the coders help each other. No professional developers will write code purely on their own. People will use large models to generate code. In case you want to debug, if you have certain technical questions, you can ask Stack Overflow, because with the community's help, well, this language will become much easier to use, especially for beginners. So plenty of modules and libraries to support, so you do not need to start from zero. Right? So we have already talked about installation, and within this course, we are using Jupyter Notebook simply because this is user friendly. You can interact with environment that can be online. However, work with a professional developer and work for very large companies, work for very large projects, maybe you should other like again, this is not what we feel. Here, I think we'll quickly summarize. Let's start with practice. So no matter which version, offline, online, Jupyter Notebook you are using, let's get familiar with the user interface. Here to illustrate, I'm going to online. So for the online version, it's similar to any other Windows software. On top, we have different menus. On the left, we have a directory that we can go to different folders and managing potential multiple workflows. And in the main page, we will write down our code in different blocks and execute them one by one. So to start with, once you have your kernel loaded, you can type down any of the code you are trying to run. For example, let's try. So to start with, without going to any Python specific things, I first want to show you several useful shortcuts in the Jupyter Notebook. So the shortcut for running the block of code, which is you can click on this one, which will give you the output. The keyboard shortcut for running a block of code is control. And so if you go to the same line of code, you can run it second time. It will give you the same output, of course. So by clicking control enter, it will run the block of code. If you have multiple blocks of code, by clicking a single run, it will not automatically run all the code in the current course. It will run block by block. So this is part of the reason why I think for directly execute the whole Python, it will run all the code together, and it will not show you the output. Unless you are ready to output. But for Jupyter Notebook, for all the code that's essentially, and it was not actually all the at once, so that we can feel free write our own separate blog and execute or write it up block by block, so that we can test it out and have a better understanding as learning. So this is the first useful software control and execute the single block. So within the gray area is the area where we write the code. And next to the block, we have a certain bracket with index. It means the order or the index or the order that we run it. So for example, here the 3 and 4 means that this is in the sequence. This is the code that we run just now. This is the most up-to-date, the most recent code we run. If you keep running the same block over and over again, number 4, 5. So what's the usage of this little index? It will help you keep track because every time we may only want to execute a single block, we don't have to execute the workflow in order from the top to the bottom. So this index will help you track which block of code was running in the most recent. So this is a little bit about the reason. Again, nothing so far related to Python. Another two very useful for C is to insert a new block. Well, there are certainly multiple ways to do this. If you want to create a new empty block, you can click at the bottom. What we can call it a block, we can call it a cell to create a new one. Alternatively, you can click on this block trying to insert a cell below so that you will have more empty. Its corresponding short key will be B and A to insert a cell after or insert the cell before. Not directly typing B and A, but to click on the cell so that it's not highlighted that we can type the code. If you type C, if you click C or if you hit C, it will create a new empty cell below. If you click on any of the existing cells and click A, it will create an empty cell. So that's another two new keys that I personally find very useful. What if we end up with too many cells and we want to delete a cell? The short key is right click, delete cell, or the short key on the keyboard is double clicking D. You press it to delete any existing. Those are relatively easy. One thing about by default, when you insert an empty cell, the type of the cell is well, that's not the only type of cell. For example, we can, in the drop-down list, instead of using the current cell as writing code, we can choose to use some other usages like markdown. What do we mean by markdown? Markdown is not something that we will write in Python, but instead it's something that we can write down, like a title, a subtitle, or some other text that's common. With what I want to do. Anything. When you run this will not be executed as Python. So this will appear as a line. Well, the reason that this is called a markdown is that sometimes it can change the format as a title or subtitle. This is purely optional. This is not part of Python or not part of the things that we need to know, but this will be useful in many things. We can insert a hashtag only when it's a markdown, followed by space. Then you can see the format will potentially become different. Then we have our cell. It will become a Python. So basically, the markdown is particularly whenever you want to make the local module of process. For example, you want to make three blocks for this purpose, and you want another markdown as sections. This is similar as you are writing as you have sections, subsections. You want to change the section, for example, as subsections. Simply adding more number of hashtags. More hashtags you have, the worse that here you compare two hashtags like subtext, three hashtags, or the font size or also the error. Again, this is totally optional, but in many cases, especially when you have a very modular structure, and I will apply to our local chapter 7, our maintain structure. On a very high level, we know what's going to. So we will be general way that you learn. We'll take a very detailed step, take down all concepts, exercises, and then we will run it first. So the first is to have not done so. let's do it. So it's in the offline version. Let's say you define where to download. Okay? Where you download it. Download. Open offline. You open it online. Online. Offline. Offline. Okay. Anyone? Very good question. Short answer is that it's open up. Typically download file from time. Let me send you download. Directly click on download. It will automatically take the file under folder of download. Save it anywhere else. But that's always download. On the file, of course, not directly. It's automatically going to download. And the directory of the download folder, you might find it offline. And it's under. So whenever you finish the installation of the offline version, we are at the most that we are everywhere under the machine. So and directly we are able to find the desktop download folder typically under username by section. And under username, you have your desktop, which is desktop, this desktop, or it's other folders like documents and the download. So you can find all the notebooks or the downloaded files. Yeah, downloaded. This may be download. Oh, where to go? But you should not worry too much about the final exam on Python, because from the previous year's history, in which consecutive years, I tend not to test programming questions in the final exam. I will give you probably exam questions on multiple choice questions, but personally, I do not think it's very appropriate to ask you to write your own code in the internet. So, but that does not make sense, because when I write my own code, I also search online. So I will give you conceptual questions in multiple choice questions, but those are hard. So that does not mean that you should not learn Python at all. And we will even see some examples in the class to give you a brief idea. And if we have time in the last lecture, if we have time, I may even show you some of the past years multiple choice. We already seen the last part of versions of Excel Python directly more. So to start with, any other questions? Any other questions before we really try to run the code together? No, any techniques? Sometimes not more. So before I just well, to start with, you can always use Python as a scientific calculator. So let me quickly add in the markdown. You don't have to do this. Which means that without understanding any of the Python syntax, we will be able to do some mathematical computation using Python. When I do not have my phone or my calculator at hand. Like, for example, we already did 1 + 1, and we can quickly try. Again, to run to execute a single cell code, you either click on this run the cell, and it will go to the next cell, or you control them. And similarly, of course, you can make, as long as it's a mathematical calculation, you will be able to execute 22.0. What we get. So I want to use the very first several examples to illustrate that Python is not, you have never used it, not that intimidated. Also to show some other potential features. For example, in this exercise, or in this cell of block, if you run it, actually we are computing 1.5 to the power of 6, which is slightly different notation-wise if you compare to Excel. So in Python, power is represented by a double stop. Instead of in Excel, I remember another thing. But here, another thing I want to show you is that this line of code does not seem to be very regular. So whatever that is happened after a hashtag is regarded as a column, which will not be executed as part of it. So this will be useful, especially when you are writing multiple lines of code and you want to temporarily, for example, if you want to simplification to the power of 4, if you add a hashtag at the beginning of the line, we will say that line is code and comment it out. Means that this line of code, this line will be a constant that will not be active. So if you run the cell again, it will only show the first line. And of course, you can see all of these steps. You can potentially have multiple lines, but there are several things. You need to make sure that each line of code on its own is executed. For example, you want to, this is a single line by itself in operation, but you want to put a single line into separate cells. For example, 1.5 to the power of 3, but you put separate lines. This will be error. This is one of the tools. Like I said, every line itself cannot just like add a user to new line. And on comments, second row that we are doing. In this cell, we are doing computation at the same time. 1.5 to the power of 3, 1.5 to the power of 4. You have multiple executions. You can also below principle only show up. So the first one is output output. So out of comments output. Let's take an example of that. So the first thing is cell by cell. So here, whenever we are in Python, I'm designing the slide to be in a particular way that things are colorful. Whenever you see a green block, it means an example or a classic. Whenever you see a red block, it's a warning. Tell you what is not, what is not. So here, for example, doing a single line code, multiple lines, is not allowed. Otherwise, so later, whenever we see a red block of notes like this, we should be cautious. This will remind us something that we should not. So let's think about a very simple example, elementary school math. But let's convert it to the Python environment. So let's think a business setting where a grocery store has 500 packs of cookies, 5% discount, and we sell another 230. We want to calculate how many packs of cookies. Mathematically, it's very, very elementary. So we just do 500 multiplied by the remaining 95%, then subtract 230. So you may be confused already. Why do we talk about this very simple example? Later, we are going to reuse this example to talk about objects, variables, and assignments. So let's go from there. But right before we continue, let's see the version in like around 35. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, come talk to us. let's continue. We will go through the slides first, then we will run the code. Here I will be using the online Jupyter Notebook, for example. So later we will run the code online together. So I will briefly talk about objects, variables, and data types. Those are very, very fundamental concepts that will help us understand, basics. So generally speaking, everything in Python, they are all objects. And each of the objects will have both a value and also a type. This is kind of similar as if we are using Excel, right? In Excel, they also have a certain data. We talk about numericals, we talk about textual, we talk about categorical, right? So this is in certain ways similar. But what is different in any programming language, not limited to Python, is that we'll be having variables and the corresponding assignment. The word assignment is not like the assignment as your homework, but the assignment comes from the word assign. Means that we are defining a new variable, we give it a name, and we assign a value. And in most cases, it will be associated with. So if this is your first lecture on any of the programming language, this is the most fundamental and the most critical things that you will need to understand, the assignment operator. Because if you never use any code, and moreover, if you are very good at math, maybe potentially this will be confusing. What does it mean by a single equal sign? Here, in any programming language, it's an assignment operator instead of the mathematical equivalent. So using the same example in the previous case, instead of directly write down the computation, which is 500 multiplied by 95% and subtract 230, we will assign a name to each of the variables. So this is, whenever we can take any analogy of what we learned in Excel, so this is somewhat similar to maybe a table. So instead of directly writing down the numbers and expressions, we will give each number a name, or each value a name. And this name or this object is called a variable, and this process of naming it and assigning a value is called assignment. So the correct way to interpret a single equal sign in Python and more generally in any programming language is not we set those two things equal in mathematics. It's more like from right to the left. We define a new variable called solid, and we assign a value of 500 to it. So the single equal sign actually means the operation of assigning. So once you understand this, all the relations very useful. So you can think this as a name and think of this 500 as cell value. Once we give it a name, so instead of the direct numerical calculation, cell reference, we can use the name that every time the operator is whenever we talk about the name of solid, Python will know that we are referring to this object that has a value of 500. And also for other errors like counter and so we can plug in any binary expression and type it. So this assignment will define name. Naming is something quite flexible. In general, you can name the variables any way you like, as long as it's legal. We'll talk about that. The name will appear on the left side of it, and the value will appear on the right side. So you can understand, again, you assign the value on the right using the name variable. So here, again, we have the red note, the text box. This is a warning that it tells us some illegal way, or what are the legal names. Because many names, if you want to name it in whatever way you like, sometimes there are certain names that are not allowed. For example, place, multiple words. That's the names of letters, numbers, and others. So here in this example, we want to name a variable of down space. It should not be any space. It should not be two separate words. Instead, we want to add multiple words. We cannot get rid of it. And void contradiction. Let me quickly show you counter examples. Those are certain that you want to make assignments of variables. For example, you want to make assignments like A, a new variable called A, and you can assign a value A. This assignment is very convenient to update any. For example, if it's one, to update anything in the assignment. After for assignment, there's assigned that makes the same assignment as different values to update. For example, initially we decided A is 1. But later we figure out right away that A is 8. Then check out the value of A is updated. 1, that is 1. So this is for all the beginners, eventually understand it's like what do we mean by A? And if the first day you write code and if you are good at mathematics, you immediately realize this equation is mathematically incorrect. Equal sign cannot be true. But if you understand from a science perspective, it really means that for whatever the current value of A, we are going to update, we are going to keep a sign that of the current value of A. So if you run this right code, and if we check for the value of A again, so it should be good. And if you run this line of code multiple times, many more times, then A every time it will increment. It will have to increment by 1. So now A should be a relatively large number. So once you understand this line of code as an example, you pretty much understand what do you mean by assignment. So let's quickly talk about the naming rule, as we say also. So in general, you can name your variables as you like, A, B, A, B. If you have a long name, like for example here we use dumper. If you separate your name by space, as if they are two words, then you will have an error. Simply because that whenever you have a space, Python will try to understand what you mean by this. Because of the space, it's no longer a coherent single name of the variable. So we should avoid spaces. If you really want, you can connect the two words together. Or if you really want to what else is not allowed to name? Or Python is not allowed to name. It's not name. So, how to name your variable is smart. That's the thing. But if you want to name your variable using at the beginning of a letter, of a number, for example, 1, 2, then it's not allowed. So the starting position of your variable name should not be a number. What else? It should not include other than a letter, a number, underscore, or some other. For example, if you want to define your variable name to be A plus B, then this is also illegal because plus is not a very legal symbol in the variable. Those are the common rules that we should take. Also, a final example is that there are certain names, special names in Python that have been reserved. For example, later we are going to learn the function called P. Not function, but the logical statement for P, which is exactly the same as in, almost exactly the same as in Excel. But if you try to define your variable in the name, it's a problem. When you are trying to get variable, there are certain words and really want to name your variable using that word, you can try making it slightly different, for example, adding energy or adding another word so that it becomes legal. But the short answer is that whenever you have a legal name, just quickly change it. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to encounter errors, as long as you know how to fix it. So by this assignment, Python will know how to compute this. But about the assignment, here's one tricky thing. So we assign the storage 500, we assign the dumper, we assign the float, and here we compute the storage afterwards. The storage afterwards is 241. However, if you check the value of storage again, it does not change. It was still the original value of 500. Why? Because through this computation, we only actually this right. We only make the calculation. We do not update any of the assignment values. In other words, original three objects, three variables, storage, their value is not changed. You want to update the storage value by entering the opposite state. So this is similar to only by the code it was right. It will show you nice. But it will not update that state of never to proper assignment. So if you check the value of A again, it's still 18. It never changes. If you want to make the assignment, means that if you want to update the value of that variable, you need to make the assignment like what you do. Storage equal to. After running this code, after running this line of code, then you see the storage updated to the new value. So whenever you want to update the value of a certain variable, you need to do the proper assignment. So that is about this technique. So in short, name on the left, value on the right, or expression on the right, we evaluate the value for the object. And from there, you do not need to refer to the value. You can directly refer to the variable's name so that you can refer to it as whenever you want. So here's another type of text block. It's not in the red color, but it's in the orange color. whenever I include in the slide using orange color, it means that it is not something that is strictly enforced. It is not a strict requirement. It's just coding style or recommendation. So the recommending style where all the professional developers are using is that, well, for better readability of the coding, it will not generate error if you do not do this, but it will improve the readability of your code. Is that after several lines of code, if you are trying to do something different, leave an empty line to make your code more modern. So if you want to become more professional, or this is some habit that you potentially quite valid. And after that, right? You didn't talk about this. This sort of difficult. Wherever it's good, I personally do not use this very often, but this part of the expert. Will have a new value of 200. So another coding style, another recommended coding style, if you want to do, again, whenever you see orange color text box, this is optional. This is not a compulsory requirement, but it's highly recommended that for the for the readability, for better readability of your code, we usually use blank space. We can express it like for the assignment, you can move 3-4 times before and after the reader. So for your readers and for yourself of your code, when reading the code, it will be easier to read. Let's do a quick multiple choice. Actually, I think this question came directly from the previous year's exam as well. So which assignment statement is correct? Without actually trying it out in Python, hopefully you can directly see the answer. So that's right. In the previous year's exam, well, don't think that, okay, we're dealing with multiple choice questions, so it's very easy. Usually I will make it harder by including a fifth option, like none of the above or all of the above. So it's quite tricky. You get the answer. Well, I mean, you can directly get the answer in the next slide, right? So I will not ask you to shout it out. So the quick answer is it should be. So why the others does not work? Right? As we say, a symbol, a unique expression, a mathematical expression symbol like plus or stars representing for multiplication, they are not allowed. And of course, we also have space there, which is also illegal in defining a variable name. Also, if you make the assignment of 2, I mean, 2 itself cannot serve as a variable name because it's starting with a number. So A, B, C are all wrong. If you run them, you try running them, it will give you an error. So option C is tricky because you may think, okay, now we are multiplying x with y. So it should be wrong. But instead, here, xy does not mean we multiply x by y. It actually really means that we are defining a new variable called x. So D will be allowed, and because D is correct, we will not use it. So in the final exam, you will encounter conceptual. Sometimes professional developers, there are certain forecasts right now, especially with updating the existing variables. For example, instead of x plus y, you can write this expression as x plus, which are equivalent. But I would say this is optimal because altogether this will be useful, especially with one. It's very difficult. Not right. Therefore, update of the assignment. This is about anything. Then we talk about data. Have states, have categorical. So objects, for example, the variable we define, they all have their own data. So depending on different data types, they will work totally differently. So for example, when we do mathematical computation, we should expect the data type to be numerical. So you can always check the data type of a certain object by using the function of type. Within the brackets, within the parentheses, you just put in the object variable. But in Python, when we talk about numbers, we do not simply, as in Excel, call them numerical. We have a more detailed category. And within the scope of this course, I'm only going to introduce 2. One is called int. INT stands for integer. The other is called float, which is floating real number. We can think of this as a general number, potentially with decimal place. We have other types of numerical types, like long and complex numbers, but we will not cover this. So this is the usage of the function called type. Whenever you have an object, like a variable name, like what we defined previously, sorry, we can use the type function output, the type of the object. If you define using an integer, for example, 5,000, it will guess or it will recognize the type as integer. Well, if you define it with, although with the exactly the same value of 5,000, but whenever you are using a decimal expression, 5,000.0, then the type will be slightly different. It will become a float. And to talk a little bit more, if you involve different types, because integer, float, they are both numbers. They are different types, but they are similar. You can use both as a mathematical calculation. If you combine both the integer and float in the same expression, you are trying to calculate something. The output, although it might still be an integer, because we are involving in the calculation the float, so it will become the float. It will allow for decimal places. So that's why in the end we'll have a float. So this is the first two data types of numerical value that we may use. We have other types that we will talk about later in today's lecture. So whenever we're talking about letters, characters, Python we call a string. It's a sequence of text, letters, numbers. So some part of the material was generated by, I think, another project. So we will use this example to illustrate. Whenever we have a text, we can do all different kinds of stuff as an extra. So whenever you are having a string and you apply the type, it will show str. So the word string actually here you can understand as text. Interestingly, some of the mathematical operators like plus and star, which means multiplication, can also be applied to strings. So by plotting two strings, we're just connecting them together, end to end. And by multiplying strings with a number, you are just printing the string out. So here's the two. You get it. That's it. So let's quickly see in notebooks, in the Jupyter notebooks, what are the quick exercises that we can do. One good thing about using Jupyter notebooks as we run the code together is that whenever you are curious about the output, what will be different if you change the input? You can directly do that because this works with interactive. You do encounter an error, you get the output as I do. Feel free to change it in the way you like anytime to see what will be different. Right? So this is what we already covered in the slide. So the type of the integer will give you int. The type of a decimal number in general will give you a type of float. And if you in the calculation, if you mix both, the output will be most likely because it will allow for decimal places. So the other type we use very often is string str. And whenever here within Python, unlike in Excel, whenever we are talking about, we use double quotation marks for text. But in Python, you can feel free to use single quotation marks or double quotation marks. Both will work. Here, for example, we are using a single quotation mark, which will give us a string consists of letters, numbers, and a blank space. So if it is a string, then empty space is allowed. And for example, if you have a number, but you use a quotation mark, then the number will not be a number anymore. The number will use a quotation mark. And here we can see it in red. So that you know type. For a string, apply multiplication and multiply and well, the meanings will be slightly different. For example, the current storage value is 5,000, and we want to multiply the 5,000 by 10 times. But instead of a float or integer, we have string. So if we directly multiply the string by 10 and plus whatever the other string is, we will have a weird output. Instead of giving the value of it will print out 6 strings 10 times. So this is how a string interacts with the multiplication of a number. So how do we compute? If you want to instead of using this 5,000 storage string as a string, what if we want to use it as a float or as a numerical value? We need to do conversion. Right? So in Excel, we just select the cell and change the data type manually. But in Python, we will do the conversion by using certain functions. Specifically, the function name will just simply corresponding type. So let's take a closer. So this storage string. So right now, this storage string is a string, and it takes the value of quote and quote 5,000. So this is a string, not a numerical value. But we can convert. If you type the function float, which means that it will take whatever object, essentially from other types, it will try it converts this object into a float. So the quotation marks disappear. Now, after applying the float function, we are dealing with a float type object instead of the string. So now we can multiply this by 10, because now it's a numerical operation. By 10, we get 50,000. And if we want to print it out together with plus this with another string, we need to convert it back to a string. So now we have a float. To convert a float back to the string, we just use str function. So we apply one extra layer outside, convert to the string, so we have our quotation marks back again. So this is how do we convert back and forth between different types. Here we just use the example of string. And the reason, if you compare these two examples, the reason that we need to do the conversion simply because we need to convert to floats to make the mathematical calculation of 10 times. Otherwise, they will just print your string for 10 times, which does not make sense. Right? So this example shows the difference, essential difference. Although you are using the same operator, which is plus or multiplication star, but depending on the object type, whether it's a float or whether it's a string, it will give you totally different operations. So you need to pay attention whenever working with those flexible operators. Let's do another quick exercise. So for all the multiple choice questions, conceptual questions, you should be able to answer all of them without actually writing them in the tutorial video. Because you can imagine what will be the output. So let's go through this together. So we assign 3.5 as a float A. We assign B as an integer of y. So we first convert A to a string, which is string 3.5, quote unquote, quotation mark. Multiply by 2. So here, because we are multiplying 2 by 2 using a string, not the value. So it should be 3.5, 3.5. Right? Print the string plus. Then this plus also another string. String is integer 1, so a string of B is just quote unquote 1. So the output will be 3.5, 3.5, 1. So the answer will be. So here, one thing is tricky. You may ask, okay, why the answer is B instead of B? Because when we make the computation, well, B should become a float, and therefore we should have 1.0. That's a valid concern. But even before the mathematical computation, we are converting the B from integer to a string. So that string, because it's converted from an integer, that string will only be 1, not 1.0. So this B is correct. If you're unsure about the result, you can always try to write the code in the digital notebook on home and test it. So this is about the object, variable, object type, and potential conversion. Here we only use the example of strings and numerical values. Potentially they are much more. And we will introduce some of them along the way. So let's spend more time talking about strings. So here we are going to introduce several very important concepts in Python, very fundamental concepts, using the example of string. So again, we will use another source code as an example. Let's suppose we have a string called hello. So one of the few things that we can directly apply to a string are certain functions and methods. For example, I will first introduce a function called len, which stands for length. It will return the length of the string, or in other words, how many characters are included in that string. We can count together. So hello will consist of plus. The source code is another 7. And the blank space in the middle is also another one. So 5 plus 1 plus 7, which will give us 13 characters. Why is this important? Because later I'm going to talk about writing, indexing, and position. So understanding the total length will become very useful. So in this exercise, we are going to have a string with a length of 13. So now we will dive in deeper, talking about the individual characters. Suppose we already have a string which has 13 characters. How should we refer to an individual character? For example, we want to refer to this little e as a letter. We use index. And the syntax of using indexing, for example, we define a new variable for greetings, which is a string of 13 characters. The syntax of indexing is to use a single bracket. And within the bracket, we put in the index for the class. But here is one of the most unnatural and the most important things, the most counterintuitive thing in Python for beginners is that the counting rule in Python is fundamentally different than many of the other widely used software and environments. To summarize, in Python, we start counting from 0, not 1. This is, I will repeat this many more times. This is very important. So some of you may have been to other continents or other countries. I think some places in the US or many places in Europe, like Germany, when counting the floor, if you go to the base floor, instead of a level 1, they will say, okay, we are at ground floor, so level 0. then the level 2 is actually level 1. So Python will behave something like that. Let me repeat this again, very, very important. Instead of counting from 1 to 3, Python will count from 0 to 1. The first element is the index of 0. So it's supposed to be first with little method. Instead of the index, yeah. So ask me why. Personally, I'm also in many cases confused because I personally use R a lot. R will start from 1. If I fix the language, I agree. But this is how Python works. And it makes sense. For example, it counts forward. First character is 0, then 1, 2, 3, 4. But we can also count back. Now suddenly the 0 makes more sense because if you count from backwards, the index to refer to the last character in the string will be -2. And the second last will be -2, and so on. So when we, for example, if we talk about this letter O and the DAO, it is the ninth element, also the fifth last element. So there are two options that you want to use as index. You can either use 8 or -5. Right. So a simple calculation will tell you that 8 plus 5 is 13, which is the total length. So that you know if you count forward or backwards, well, equally like you can use either way. Sometimes it depends on which way is more convenient for you to count. So I cannot emphasize this much more. This is very important and potentially different than many of the other languages. So this is indexing when you want to refer to a single character, to a single element in the string. This is not only true for a string with multiple characters, but also true for any Python object with multiple elements as a list. It's similar. We will do counting in the forward backward. What if we want to refer to multiple elements? For example, instead of a single character like the little e as a single character, we want to refer to a substring. The name substring is a subset. It's a smaller string that's being contained by the current string. We will use something called slice. Like the name does not matter that much, but we will use this expression, the slicing expression, to access a subset, smaller part of the existing string. So the syntax in Python to use a slicing operation is instead of a single index we used previously, a single index, positive 1, -5, a single index will refer to a single character. But here for slicing means that we are selecting multiple characters, essentially a subset of strings, we will use this syntax. We need to identify three parameters and separate it by the order. The 3 parameters are called starting point, stopping point, and step point. So this sounds a little bit complicated, but let me show you some examples to help you understand. Again, just remember, we use 2 columns to separate 3 inputs: starting point, stopping point, and step point. And later we will talk about the default value. The default value of the starting point is 0, which means the first element. Always remember we start counting from 0. So by default, we start counting from the first element. And by default, the stopping point is the length of the string, which in the previous example, the default would be 13. But as you can see, 13 is not even available. So this is another rule that we have to remember. I will repeat this multiple times in a moment. Starting point and stopping point. Starting point will be included, but stopping point will not be included. So by definition, the stopping point is the index before which the slide stops. So here I'm only going through the definition of the concept. We will use more examples to help you better. And the step size is by the name. So let's understand through several examples. In order to refer to a substring or a subset of the current string, let's take a closer look at 3 examples. So we will start by this 0, 5, 1. What does it mean? Let's plug in the definition. We will start with index 0, which is the first element, include. We will stop with the 5, with index 5, which is the 6th element. But always remember, stopping point is not included. So we actually refer to index from 0 to 4. And the step size is 1 means that we include all the elements. Step size actually means that every time we jump for 1 index. So this number, this expression, slicing expression, the 0, 5, 1, actually means 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which will give us the word of 0, the first 5 letters. Let's take another look. Let's take a look at another example. What do we mean by 9, 13? So again, let's plug in the definition. By definition, we will start at index number 9, which is the 10th element, which will give us 2. We will stop at 13. So we do not have an index for 13, but we stop before 13, which is the last element. And the step size of 1 will be like basically this will represent the last 4 characters. And another example to show you what if the step size is not 1. Here, if the step size is 2, it means that every time we skip a character. So we start from 0, which is the first element, included. We stop at 13, which is not included, so we could include previous one. Then every time we skip to the step size is 2 means that every time skip one element and jump to the next. So we will end up with H, L, O, U, O, every other, all the operators, or all the indices are indexes. So this is what we mean by starting point, stopping point, and step. The only thing that you need to remember is that starting point is included from stopping point. And this will allow us to have a stopping point that is larger than the largest point, means that we stop at the last time. Well, you may think, okay, this is relatively easy. I understand so far. To make things more complicated, well, this is tricky. To make things more complicated, sometimes if the three arguments, starting, ending, step size, if some are taking the default value, remember, we mentioned in the few slides ago, the default values are 0, length of the string, which in this exercise is 13, and the step size is 1. If some inputs are taking their default value, then it is legal, or Python will allow us to omit them. Means that it's okay not to write them at all. For example, for the same exercise where we take the substring of hello, which starts from 0 and at 5 and step size is 1, pay attention that the starting point is 0, which is default. Step size is 1, which is default. So because both are default, we can ignore them. We do not have to write them down explicitly. So this 0, 5, 1 will give us the same output as only if we have a column 5. So this will make our life much trickier because for beginners, if you see something like writing like 0, 5, 1, we immediately know what it represents. But if you see a column 5, it will take you some time to complete the original sliding curve. Then I can understand what it is. So this summation or this simplification will make it easier. So to give you more examples for the two other exercises, for example, from 9 to 13, step size is 1. 13 is the default. Step size 1 is default. So we can omit them. So it's equivalent at least to a writing a slide of 9 columns. So it means you're taking 9 as the starting point, and all the other two arguments are empty. So same as before, we are taking the last 4 characters. And equivalently, for starting point and ending point, well, instead of using the forward function, we also use the negative number, which is coming from back. They are equivalent. So a quick trick is that the forward and backward index in the absolute value will always add up to the left. Here we have total length of 13, 9 plus 4, 8 plus 5. So you can use this trick to quickly locate if you want to count forward or back. And for the final example, for the case where we do not have step size of 1, here we have a step size of 2. But for the first, the starting point and the stopping point, they are both default. So it's okay for us to ignore them. But we cannot ignore the column. Without the column, we do not know which is for this. After 2 columns, so we know this 2 is the step size, so we will take alternate error. So this is why the slicing will become very difficult. So later, if you are still a bit confused, I encourage you to later we will run them together, and potentially you can also change the slicing index to see what are the outputs, whether it's consistent with your expected. So we will run it together. So to give you a more concrete example, let's try this out, try to understand from a coding perspective. Again, we have a slicing expression. It's empty, -1, step size of 4. So empty in the first argument means that the starting point is empty, which means the default, which means 0. So we should start counting from the first element, including. So we will have the first 8. Where do we stop? We stop at -1, which is the last element, but not included. So whenever we need to include this last element to be excluded from the output. And the step size is 4. So we should every time we should pick 3 elements. So we will have the first 8. The fifth 3 have a little O. We skip another 3, including the blank state. We have another big O. Then we skip another 3, and we end up with the stopping point. But again, remember the stopping point is to be excluded. So we will end up with only 3 characters, 8 more O. So through this exercise, hopefully you have a better understanding of what do they mean by the 3 arguments. Starting, included, stopping, excluded, and the step up. For another quick exercise, and easy quiz. Well, in this course, we do not have any quiz, so that's why. So let's manually count. So -8 and -2. We only have 2 numbers, right? Because the third number is the step size, and it's being ignored, means that it's taking the default step size of 1. So we only care about the starting and stopping. The starting point is -8. Let's manually count. Where is minus? From backwards, right? So Z, which is the last element, is -1, -2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we should start with this letter 8. And we end at -2, which is high. But remember, starting point is included, so we should have 8. And the stopping point will not be included, so I will not be included. So we will start with A, stop at Q with step size 1 with the answer 15. So that's how manually we come. Okay. So now you may have a question, okay, I get overwhelmed, I get confused. Why is this useful? Well, this liking expression is not only useful in referencing substrings or referencing subsets, but it will also become very, very useful when we are introducing groups using arrays. So this is a new function that we will talk about in the future. That we will use that in this range function, it will use a very similar syntax. It will take 3 inputs. And by the range function, the 3 inputs are exactly the same as the slicing. It will take the starting point, the starting index, stopping index, and the step. So why is this useful? Let me quickly show you. For example, if you give a range function 3 numbers, 0, 5, 1, it will generate this 0, 1, 2. If it's a range of 0, 3, it will give it 0, 1. Simply give a single integer range. For example, range 6. Range 6 will automatically generate 0, 1. Why is this helpful? Why is this? Because later after return, we will realize that by generating this thing, helps us. This is probably the but what about? So have this string exercise, and we are not ready yet to talk about it. Exercise. And but it's not hard yet. But it's aside and okay. Or even if it's a and so it I ask what it does. I find myself actually know exactly the point. Here. After that's it. So now let's talk about math. Relative. But we are showing all of the time. So for example, when we have a string, which is a sentence that we find a name of line, we can directly apply certain methods. Well, the methods are actually functions that are associated with specific data. So for example, if we have a string, there are certain functions that we can only apply. For example, to convert string after the those are functions that are designed specifically for the string type, and we call them methods. Whenever we are using a new method, we can directly put the syntax will be directly after the name of the string or the object and put a dot. For example, the method name is called upper, which will convert the string to uppercase. And the string's name is called line. Then we can just directly write down line dot upper. And within the bracket are extra, which we do not require any. So this will give us the same string, but with all the letters converted to uppercase. Equivalently or similarly, we can convert all of them to lowercase. We can choose to capitalize, which is only convert the first letters of the symbol. We can choose to small case, which is convert lower to upper and upper to lower. Also, we can choose to title all the words, which is to convert all the first letters of the word upper. So the exact method name, we do not need to remember all of them, but this is just to illustrate for the string type object. There are associated specific functions or methods that we can directly apply by connecting using a function. So there are some other methods that are potentially more useful. For example, there's a method of string of find. If you have a very long string and you want to find out what is the position or the index, the substring or a specific index, you can use the method. So for example, within the string we were talking about, which consists of 13 characters, we want to find the department name CAO. It will give us the index of the starting point of that substring, which is index number 10. So whenever you are using find, the return value is so it finds return quite much. Actually, here's why. Yes, yes. This line has first appearance. For example, find a X. Then you may have a question, what is your search? That whether you don't find any, then you will return a find. does not mean that it is a lost pattern. It actually means that it didn't find it. Let's quickly. This is what we already covered. We first learned the length function, which is just LES. It will measure how many individual elements, how many individual characters. Of course, this length function can also be applied to other objects, but we will apply in the future. So if you want to access the individual characters by the index, pay attention that we start counting from here. So index one actually means the second level. And so this is a single character register. And you can also count from backwards. -1 is the last character. -5 is the first. And the following are all the exercises we did before, including the slicing, which will give you 3 numbers: starting point, stopping point, and step size. Actually, this is exactly the same as what we showed in the slide. Also, if you choose not to put in anything, like a single column or a double column, means that you are taking everything for default. It will give you the entire string by itself. And of course, to make things more challenging, sometimes you can choose to ignore part of the input as long as they're equal. So here, column 5, actually you can try to complete it in your head first. It means 0, 5, 1. So essentially this exercise is equivalent to this. It will generate exactly the same output. Hello, the last 4 digits of numbers and all the alternate actions. And this exercise we also covered in the slide is taking every other force of the data, each small data. And same here for the reforming method. You can even try it out and define method. You can quickly try if you want to find something that does not exist using the find method. For example, what do we not have? We do not have x in this way. So if you directly want to find x, to give you pay attention to this. It does not mean that your last character is x. It actually means that Python has not defined this character. Then we have the next example, which is the second example that we are not going to cover today, because again, it requires the understanding of the while loop. After talking about the while loop, the for loop, we will come back to revisit those 2 examples. One is peer leading, the other is to explain out the first letter of the name. If you're interested after the lecture, you can copy paste the code, or you can copy paste the screenshot, give it to the large model, see how it will explain the code. This will become very useful in many cases. So you can learn from it. So we will have a very, very quick start about the control flow statement, and we will leave everything in the next step. Because I really want to start by the motivational example. We already learned many of the examples. Logical statements, learn, next, or, and here, then they basically represent but in the most standard way. Okay, and motivate why control flow statement is important. I would like to use the example from another one of my favorites. I tried to show you red, but the Big Bang Theory is not really more recent. So if you still remember in one of the episodes, like the nerd, the geek, were trying to make friends using this so-called flow chart. Well, flow chart is one example of a control flow statement. Depending on what is your answer, like for example, if this is an if statement, depending on the answer whether it's no or yes, we will go to the other way. So the funny thing about this flow is that when our guy was trying to make a phone call to make a new friend, he was stuck in the infinite loop. So later we will learn loop, if statements, and things like that. So if you are a fan of the show, you get what I'm talking about. If not, forget about it. So for the control flow, we will start with something that we already know. This is exactly the same, or at least similar to what we have learned in Excel. If you make a statement that can only be true or false, then the output is either true or false or F, which is exactly the same as what we have learned in Excel. The only difference is that the actual mathematical equal sign will be using a double equal sign. So whenever you see a single equal sign in Python, it means assignment. Whenever you see a double equal sign, it actually means mathematically. And for the not equal sign, instead of a greater or less, here in Python we use exclamation mark. So those are the minor syntax differences between Python and Excel. All the remaining are more or less. But nevertheless, we will continue the rest, including the 2 examples we picked after we cover all the concepts of control flow. Probably next. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to write an email or directly talk to me. I will see you next.